Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining another NoBeC talk. My name is Paulius. I am the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics of the University of Pennsylvania. And we are going to start today's NoBeC talk. So as most of you already probably know, we follow an agenda that is similar to this every time. So I will give a very short welcome. Then we will have a pre-recorded video presentation of our early career researcher for today, which is Dr. Eric Thulin from the NGO RARE in the US. And then we will have our main talk for today, which is by Dr. Diego Aycinena from the Universidad del Rosario in Colombia. And then we will have 15 minutes for Q&A. So as I always do, I want to remind you that this speaker series is organized by the Penn Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. We are a research center at the University of Pennsylvania that works on enabling organizations to enact positive behavioral change. We do mainly consulting, research, and training. You have our webpage here, and you have a QR code to our Twitter account. Please follow us for all our news. We have lots of publications coming out, events, and other things. And as I always do, I wanted to share a small piece of news with you about the work that our center is doing. In this case, I don't have a specific project, but I wanted to share with you that we are opening our monthly center bulletin for external people. This used to be an internal newsletter with news from our members. So if you're interested, you can subscribe in the link that is there and also scan the QR code, and we will share a link for the latest version of the bulletin. In the bulletin, you will find once a month news from our work and our members' work, including mentions in the news, events, publications, and so on, just to keep up to date with what we're doing, our research, our findings, and so on. A few ground rules. If this is the first time that you're joining, please remember to keep yourself muted. If you can, please turn on your camera so that we have a more interactive experience. If you want, change your username to reflect your affiliation. It's always nice to know where you're joining from. For questions, we have 2 co-authors in the audience today, so feel free to ask any questions in the chat and the co-authors will be answering them. And then we have a Q&A slot at the end, and you can raise the hand, use the raise hand function to ask questions. Then, as always, we are transmitting live on Facebook right now, and the video of this talk will be available next week on our website, nobectalks.com. With that, I'm going to play today's pre-recorded early career researchers presentation. Today we have Dr. Eric Thulin, the Director of Behavioral Science at the Center for Behavior and the Environment at RARE. And the title of the talk is Helping the Climate Because Others Do, Psychological Predictors of Intention to Perform High Impact Pro-Environmental Behaviors. You have a QR code here, which will take you to Eric's Twitter account if you want to follow him. And let me play the video now.
Hey there, my name is Eric Thulin, and I lead research and design at the Center for Behavior and the Environment at the nonprofit RARE. So RARE is an environmental behavior change NGO, and the Center for Behavior and the Environment exists within RARE as a sort of field building initiative to increase the uptake of behavioral science in the environmental space. So I did this work with Rahim Rekhamov, who works on the Make It Personal team here at RARE to increase the adoption of climate-friendly behaviors. And this work really focuses on trying to understand what is it that motivates people to adopt these high-impact pro-environmental behaviors. This work started back in 2017 when the center launched a research project to identify the highest impact opportunities for individual behavior change for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This resulted in the report above, which should be out in peer-reviewed form in behavioral science and policy in the next couple months. But the cash out of that research was the finding that if we were to get 10% of Americans to adopt this suite of high-impact behaviors, we could make a significant dent in the US commitment under the Paris Climate Agreement. But the important thing to stress here is high impact. So we aren't talking about recycling or turning off the lights. The actions we identified included switching to a green energy provider, switching to an EV, installing rooftop solar, and purchasing carbon offsets. And the report led RARE to launch a program called Make It Personal, which focused on how to apply behavioral science insights to develop interventions to increase the adoption of these behaviors. And the first research question we had was what psychologically appears to be driving the behaviors. So it'll surprise none of you to learn that we are far from the first folks to ask what drives pro-environmental behavior. And when we reviewed the literature, we found three kind of running themes. So the first was climate change beliefs, recognizing the human cause of climate change and their negative effects has been shown to predict various green behaviors. The second was political orientation. So conservatives are less likely to engage in pro-environmental behaviors, even after you adjust for various demographics. And finally, we've got social expectations, the underpinning of social norms. So a robust literature has shown that shifting these can drive various forms of pro-environmental behavior, from energy conservation to littering. But this literature falls short in a few ways. First, it almost exclusively focuses on commonplace behaviors, which might have very different drivers than these high impact, but very uncommon behaviors. Second, no one has attempted to understand the relationship between all three variables, meaning that confounding could explain some of those past results. To address this, we launched a 1,500 respondent survey, quota matched to the US Census. We measured each of these constructs as well as intention to perform these high impact behaviors in the next year. I only have time to show you a couple key findings. So in these models, you see the unique value of each of those constructs predicting intention to perform each of our high impact behaviors. First, I want to draw your attention to how similar the coefficients for each of these four models are. What predicts solar is more or less the same thing that predicts green energy, offsets, and electrical vehicle adoption. But working our way up from the bottom, we see what doesn't matter. So first off, once you account for these other predictors, political orientation predicts almost nothing. In fact, the only significant predictor is conservatives being slightly more interested in offsets. Second, we see that again, once you adjust for other beliefs, believing in climate change doesn't seem to be all that important. Instead, what we see as a consistent pattern across all behaviors is that the only significant unique predictors of intending to take high impact climate action are normative expectations, so believing that others think you should take these actions, and even far more importantly, empirical expectations, so believing those around you are engaging in these actions. It's important to recognize these exploratory results are only cross-sectional. So even after adjusting for a slew of demographics, there certainly may be lurking third variables relevant to this effect. However, this is the first time we've been able to horse race these variables, showing that many of those earlier findings of the relevance of political orientation and climate beliefs might simply be due to a failure to account for social expectations. I also want to share one of our other secondary findings with you guys. I think this group will get to particularly enjoy it. So our data let us get at the accuracy of normative expectations. I apologize for the lack of confidence intervals, but I promise you these are all significant differences. So here we find that across the 6 behaviors we investigated in a broader study, every one of them shows an underestimate for the proportion of people who think people should adopt the behavior. In fact, for 5 of the 6 behaviors, a majority believe that people should engage in them, but the average person thinks that a majority only support green energy. So this suggests a really obvious opportunity for intervention to promote conversations in a way to bring these normative expectations in line with reality. That's all I have time for today, but if you want to learn more, you can pause the video and grab the preprint of these findings, the QR code above, or type in the URL. And if you got questions, feel free to hit me up on Twitter at the handle listed below.
Great. Thank you so much, Eric, for such a great presentation. That was very interesting. So I'll come back to my presentation. So yeah, unfortunately, we don't have enough time to have a Q&A with Eric, but Eric is in the audience. So if you have any questions, if you would like to connect with him, please write in the chat. And hopefully you'll be able to discuss there. And now I'm going to present our main speaker for today. So Dr. Diego Aycinena is an experimental and behavioral economist. He is an associate professor of economics on leave at the Universidad del Rosario in Bogota, Colombia, and also a research affiliate at the Economic Science Institute at Chapman University. He is temporarily serving as alternate executive director for Central America and Belize at the Inter-American Development Bank. He has been a consultant with various institutions, and his research uses economic experiments in the lab and in the field to understand the influence of social norms on human behavior, time preferences, and individual decision-making, as well as the properties of various institutions and market mechanisms. His research has been published in peer-reviewed journals such as Experimental Economics, Review of Economics and Statistics, Frontiers in Behavioral Neuroscience, and American Economic Journal, Applied Economics, among others. Our moderator for today, as in several previous occasions, is Dr. Oygun Demand, who's an associate professor of practice in behavioral and decision sciences and a core member of our center here at the University of Pennsylvania. So with that, yeah, I give the floor to Diego for his talk. I think you're on mute.
Here we go. Okay, thank you very much, Paulius, for the generous introduction, and thank you, Eugen, and everyone for the invitation. Today, I'm going to be presenting joint work with Francesco Bogliacino and Eric Kimbrough, who are attending here as well. We'll be focusing on a project designed to assess different methods to elicit normative expectations or perceived injunctive norms, you know, as many people refer to them. So, okay. So I don't need to tell this crowd about the increasing interest in social norms in economics and other social sciences. But it's important to start with a definition of social norms. Although not everyone agrees with a precise definition, and there are different the definitions that people use. We can start with Cristina Bicchieri's definition of social norms as behavioral rules with a preference to conform that is conditional on beliefs that most people in a reference network either conform to both conform to the behavioral rule, what people refer to empirical expectations, or sometimes perceived descriptive norms or first order descriptive beliefs, and as well with the belief that people should comply, or what is referred to as normative expectations or perceived injunctive norms, or second order normative beliefs. Now, the key here is that measuring beliefs is a central part of the study of social norms. And there are different tools in the standard methods that have been used to examine empirical expectations, right? So we have standard belief elicitation methods, and these have been examined thoroughly in the literature, using experiments, theory, and different methods. Now, to measure normative expectations, there are mainly two incentivized methods that have been used. One was proposed by Krupka and Weber, 2013. The other, we first see it in the literature by Bicchieri and Xiao in 2009. And the question we have here is, how reliable are these methods? We want to explore the properties, potential drawbacks, and the robustness of these methods, and to variations that we propose or that we explore for these methods. So today I'll be presenting the first part of a large multi-study project that aims at assessing both of these methods and proposing examining potential improvements. Now, what we do is not a horse race between the two methods. The two methods focus on different aspects of the norms. So we'll be assessing each one on its own merits, its own potential drawbacks, and examining potential variations for improvement. We'll be presenting lab experiments using different versions of the Dictator game, as well as several vignettes of naturally occurring situations that people may encounter in their ordinary life. So to start, let's focus on each method and some of the questions that we'll be asking. So again, the one method, the method by Bicchieri Xiao, uses a two-step elicitation procedure. First, eliciting in a non-incentivized way personal normative beliefs. That is, individuals' beliefs about what ought to be done in a particular situation. After that, the second step consists of an incentivized elicitation of beliefs regarding others' responses to the first task. That is, an incentivized elicitation of second-order beliefs or normative expectations. Now, the key implicit assumption in this method is that in the second step, participants expect individuals to truthfully report their personal normative beliefs. So a potential problem with this would be expected social desirability bias. And I say potential problem and expected because this may pose a problem, and it's something we'll try to examine. So if subjects correctly or incorrectly expect non-truthful responses of personal normative beliefs, then the second step is not really capturing the normative expectations. So the second step would be capturing second order beliefs about social desirability. So now, of course, someone might not truthfully report in the first step their personal normative beliefs, but you might simply ignore that people do so. So perhaps you're not aware, or you're not sophisticated enough to figure out that people do so. So even if there's social desirability bias in the first step, that does not necessarily imply that there will be in the second step. So the key question is whether people expect social desirability bias in the responses to the first question in the second step. So some of the research questions that we're asking here is, to what extent this method, the method by Bicchieri and Xiao, I just call it BX from now on, is susceptible to social desirability bias. Is it subject to improvement by recovering the full distribution of normative expectations in an incentive compatible way? So typically, this method just recovers the most appropriate action and the beliefs regarding the higher order beliefs about the most appropriate action, or in some instances, the distribution about the singleton for the most appropriate action. So here we're examining or proposing an alternative, a variation, to see if we can recover the full distribution of normative expectations and how that changes normative expectation elicitations that we observe. Then we examine to what extent is this method prone to type 1 errors or false positives. So a lot of the times we care about measuring social norms, not just in the lab for testing different theories, but in the field where people are reporting true behavior, because we may want to change behavior, and understanding normative expectations and social norms is an important component of it, as highlighted by the previous presentation by Eric. So one important question is this prone to type 1 errors for people reporting normative beliefs in instances where there is no normativity? So we'll try to address this type of question. And we address some other questions, for instance, boredom, tiredness, or is there learning relevant in the process of eliciting norms multiple times using this method. So that's a summary of the first method and the research questions we're asking. The second method is the method proposed by Krupka and Weber. This is a coordination game with multiple equilibria on social appropriateness of behavior. You can think of it as an incentivized matching mechanism to the modal responses of other participants regarding the social acceptability of different actions in a particular situation. The original method uses 4 categories, from very socially inappropriate to very socially appropriate. And the key assumption here is that collectively shared normative beliefs create a focal point, so that in this coordination game of multiple equilibria, where any choice can be an equilibrium, collectively shared normative beliefs create a focal point and drive individuals towards to coordinate based on those shared normative beliefs. Now, some of the research questions we're interested here is, can this method appropriately handle asymmetric differences in deviations from normatively prescribed actions? So this method examines the intensity or the intensive margin of social acceptability. Now, that intensive margin can be examined on different actions, including actions that are that deviate from the prescribed normative action, either by being too selfish or too generous. So we want to understand whether those deviations from in that asymmetry are appropriately handled by this mechanism, or is it subject to improvement by adding a neutral option. We also examine, in cases where perhaps participants do not know whether adding an incentive compatible option of simply revealing that you don't know the normativity of an action, whether that can improve or help with this method, or whether it is vulnerable to sunspot equilibrium problems. People just coordinating on any actions regardless of normativity. Finally, we also examine some similar questions to the previous method. Is it prone to type 1 errors or false positives? And is boredom, tiredness, or learning relevant in this method? So our contribution to the literature is in the assessment of empirical methods to elicit beliefs or expectations. As previously mentioned, there is a very large literature examining the properties of factual belief elicitation methods, which are used toward eliciting social beliefs as a way to examine empirical expectations or perceived descriptive norms. There is much less in the methodological literature on normative expectations, and most of it is based on assessments of the Krupka-Weber mechanism. This has been used to assess or to examine sensitivity to variations in orders, in roles, in experience by some of the work cited here. I'm going to have to, I will not have a chance to enter into details of these different contributions due to time constraints, but there are several that have already started examining properties of this mechanism, and one that perhaps is relevant to ours is the last one by Falucci and Nocenso, who examine normative expectations under the Krupka-Weber, to how robust it is to competing sources of focality. So we have a parallel effort to theirs and essentially reach pretty much the same conclusions. Now, for the other method, for the method by Bicchieri and Xiao, there's no paper that we know of that focuses on methods questions. Although there are a few papers that do make contributions to such questions. And it's been recently brought to our attention, a project by Harrison and Ross. I believe it's work in progress that precisely tries to tackle some of these questions for this method or a method that's very similar to this. So let me try to get into the design. This is going to be a complex design. As I mentioned, I'm presenting here 4 lab experimental studies. We conducted this with using 2 different sessions. Each session started with participants having to solve for 7 minutes 3 GMAT questions in order to earn money. Then they took part in either one of these two tracks. So the first track, they participated in one of 4 possible treatments for the Krupka Weber KW study number 1. After they completed that, they participated in study 2 of BX. So between study 1 and study 2, they used different methods. For the track B sessions, again, they started with the GMAT questions, then they did the BX study 1 in one of 4 possible treatments, and then they switched to the method KW for KW2. So in studies 1 for both BX and KW, participants, we elicit normative expectations using a single dictator game. And then they move to the second part, which use different methods where we elicit normative expectations for 2 dictator games and a bunch of different situations with multiple actions. So let me go into detail for each one of these studies. So for the first study, KW1, as previously mentioned, they start with a GMAT questions for 7 minutes. Then they are assigned to, at the session level, to one of 4 possible treatments. So we have a 2x2 design. And we elicit normative expectations over 11 possible actions in a dictator game, involving from sending no amount out of money to sending the full amount of money to the second player. Participants in none of these studies, they did not take part in the dictator game. We simply elicited norms after presenting dictator games to them. So in the first treatment is a dictator game based on the dictator game, where we vary the origin of the endowment. So in one treatment, they see the standard manna from heaven endowment for the dictator. And in the second, the dictator, the player 1, has to earn the endowment. And we describe it precisely as Cherry et al. Did. Again, solving GMAT questions for a much longer period of time to earn the endowment, which dictators then had to decide over how to split with player 2. Our second treatment variable is going to be a method treatment, where either we use the baseline, the original Krupka-Weber mechanism with 4 categories, or we add a 5th neutral category in the middle. So this one basically says that an action is neither socially inappropriate nor socially appropriate. And partly we want to see how this handles asymmetries, whether this creates focality and people use this to coordinate, or whether people use this to resolve uncertainty when they do not know the answer, the normative answer to some questions. So we have a standard 2x2 design with about over 100 participants in each cell. Our BX study 1, again, we start the same with GMAT questions. We elicit personal normative beliefs and normative expectations over 3 potential actions in a dictator game with a restricted action space. We also use a 2x2 design with the same treatments for dictator game in terms of the origin of the endowment. So we either have a standard or player 1 earned. And then our second variation is whether we use the baseline or social desire or an induced source of social desirability bias treatment. And the way we do this is at the beginning of the experiment, we assign monitors randomly from the student, from the subject population. So we select some subjects at random after they have taken part in the GMAT. We describe very generally the experiment, including a dictator game, where we simply state that participants will have to, where in the dictator game, we state that participants have to decide how to split money between 2 of them. The key feature or the key distinction is that third-party monitors in the social desirability bias treatment can sanction or are required to sanction subjects based on the reported personal normative beliefs, and that they are kept unaware of the player 1 earned treatment manipulation. So we do not tell them the source of the endowment of the funds that dictators have for the treatment. So where the funds come from. So presumably what we expect is that participants, monitors in this treatment will tend to view fairly unfavorably distributions that are self-serving to the dictator, even in the case of P1E, because they are unaware of the source of the endowment. And again, so we have a 2x2 treatment with over 100 subjects per cell in each treatment. Now to the experimental design for study 2 for KW. Here, participants, we elicit 19 normative expectations in 19 different situations, over 150 possible actions in total. So they start with a dictator game that's different from the dictator game that they saw in the first part of the study that they took part. Then we do 17 vignettes for naturally occurring situations and different actions that an individual could face in those natural occurring situations, and they finish with another dictator game. We randomize 4 treatments at the session level. So the baseline is, again, the original Krupka-Weber mechanism. The neutral is the same as described above, adding a neutral category. We have an exo treatment, which takes the baseline and highlights a column, the very socially inappropriate column, to provide a source of exogenous coordination and see how robust the elicitation is to that manipulation. And finally, the I don't know treatment nests the neutral treatment and adds an incentivized way to reveal that you don't know. Essentially, if you are truly uncertain about the 4 possible, about the 5 possible options, you can choose the I don't know, and it will pay you randomly with probability that dominates guessing randomly.
Diego, let me just pause you for a sec. Christina might have a clarification question. You're muted, Christina. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you so much. In the previous slide, it was not clear to me in the Krupka-Weber slide. If you go back one slide.
This one?
Yes. There is the P1E and the important, no, the next slide, but anyway, it doesn't matter. The observer does not know that there is a P1E option, correct?
Correct.
Is it common knowledge?
Yes. So
okay, this is very important, because if I am a decision maker, I will I will overcome probably the need to take more, the sense that I am allowed to take more, knowing that I may be punished because of that, because the other guy doesn't know that I deserve it. Correct?
Yeah. So this is a great question. Let me clarify. So in this in our experiments, no participant plays any dictator game. We describe the dictator game as it was implemented by Cherry et al. So we give them a detailed description of how the dictator worked in their experiment, including the common knowledge aspect of it. What we vary here is whether the monitors, who are subjects randomly selected from the population and from the participants in an experiment, whether they know the source of the endowment or not. So we give a very general description, telling them, participants will see a description. We don't call it a dictator game, but we describe it, where one player has to decide how to split money between 2 players, and the second player just takes whatever the first player sends to them. Only afterwards do we give detailed information, and we do so while the monitors have been moved to another room, another virtual room. We conducted these experiments online in Zoom rooms. So I don't know if this clarifies.
Up to a point, let me see at the chat. Francesco responded, we already showed that the 2 monitors are moved to another room to receive separate instruction. Out of the room, okay. Is clear what happens to the monitors? Is, again, maybe I wasn't understanding very well. It's not clear to me if I am one player and I am a P1E, okay, and I know I am a P1E, obviously, if I know that they will not know. I know that you don't know.
Whether the participants know that the monitor does not know.
Absolutely. The monitor doesn't, it's very clear. Right. I, participant, do I know that they don't know?
That is a great question. And we believe we were clear enough, but we asked that question unincentivized after they had taken part of the first part of the study. And we asked them, do you think the monitors knew where the source of the money came from? So we asked them precisely to ensure what you're asking.
I would like to know the answer.
Some of them realize it, some of they don't. And we see that the effects are concentrated on the ones that do realize it. So thank you for the opportunity to clarify. So I believe, yes, so I had explained the different options for the KW2 study. And let me move to the last part to the second BX study. So here again, we elicit both personal normative beliefs and normative expectations over 11 situations. So essentially we do 2 dictator games and half of the situations used in the other method. We randomly vary these by session to ensure that we cover all the possible situations. And we do 2 treatments. We do the baseline treatment, where we do a 2-step elicitation method following the BX method, where in the first step, we select an action and participants, and we elicit unincentivized the personal normative belief, the singleton, the single most appropriate action that individuals believe. In the second step, we ask them to predict the distribution of responses in step 1 out of 10 randomly selected participants from the session. They earn money if they are accurate, otherwise they earn nothing. The second treatment, the BESA treatment, we also use a 2-step procedure. So we embed the BESA treatment in the BX framework. The BESA is the belief elicitation by superimposition approach proposed by Fragiadakis et al. And it consists of having a budget of 100 tokens, which you have to allocate amongst the different actions. In the first step, they allocate 100 tokens to the moral worthiness of the different actions in a given situation. So here there's already some deviation because we're asking them to give us a relative judgment of the moral worthiness. The second step, we ask them to predict the average distribution of token allocations for 10 randomly selected participants in the session. We use a random lottery mechanism. So we select one action at random, and they get paid according to a random lottery, which pays either 30,000 with a probability P or 5,000 with probability 1 minus P, where P is determined by the lowest of either the estimated amount or the actual amount, the actual number of participants who selected the actual number of tokens by the average, the actual average number of tokens by all participants for the selected action. And here we have about 200 participants in each of the 2 treatments. So if there are no questions that I need to address, I'm sure my co-authors can do a good job so that I can jump into the results. Okay. So let me go very quickly. Experimental sessions were conducted online in Zoom. We have a very large sample of participants from several universities in Bogota, from the Rebel subject pool. We pre-registered hypotheses in OSF, and payments were delivered via digital channels. So let me move first to the results from BX1. So from this, our main question is whether the method is susceptible to social desirability bias. As I mentioned, we have a restricted action space in the dictator. So we have 3 possible allocations: 80-20 allocation, a 45-55. We tried to break the equal split because we felt it was strongly focal based on pilots that we run. And then another one was an 20-80 split, so very strongly unfavorable for the dictator. What we would expect to see here is that we see a reduction in what we see here is the personal normative beliefs. So for the 45 55 split, and here for the 80-20 split. So what we see is in the standard dictator game, personal normative beliefs are very high for the 45-55 for the close to equal split, and we see a dramatic reduction for the player one earned dictator game. So this is not surprising, right? This is what we would expect to see. The opposite is true for the 80-20 split, right? So for the 80-20 split, we see very strong support, or rather very high level of reported personal normative beliefs for the 80-20 split. The question we have is, what happens when we introduce social desirability bias? So what we would expect to see is people reporting less frequently the 80-20 split in the P1E treatment under social desirability bias compared to when there's no social desirability bias in the baseline. We see this, and the effect is marginally significant with a p-value of 0.07. We don't see the same level of statistical significance for the 45-55. This was a puzzle to us at first, and I think part of it is because we were not expecting to see people shifting all the way to the 20-80 split for the personal normative beliefs under the social desirability bias treatment. I'm going to show you later on that that's partly what happens here. The question is, what happens? Does this carry over to normative expectations? And we see that it does carry over, again, marginally significant p-value of 0.09 for the 80-20 split. So for the 80-20 split, we do see a small reduction in the P1E treatment from the baseline to the treatment where we have social desirability bias. We don't see a large increase here as we would have expected in the 45-55 split. And again, as I mentioned, it's because the composition of both personal normative beliefs and normative expectations is changing and is shifting under social desirability bias all the way to the 20-80 split, to the split most unfavorable to the dictator, even under the P1E due to social desirability bias. So let me zoom in and focus on the question that Cristina had precisely. So as I mentioned, we asked an unincentivized question to figure out whether they were aware of the asymmetry information between the monitors and participants. And what we see is that these are the normative expectations for the 80-20 split in the player one earned for baseline and social desirability bias treatments. So when they're not aware, we see no difference. When they are aware, we do see a difference. We see a drop of about 13 percentage points, right? So the effect seems to be there when participants are aware of the asymmetry information of the monitors. And as I mentioned before, what we see is also a change in the composition. So here we have the normative expectations for the 80-20 split, the roughly equal split of 45-55, and the 20-80 split. So the most disadvantageous distribution for the dictator. And what we see here is that 13 percentage point reduction in the P1E with social desirability bias, about half of it goes to the roughly equal split, and about half of it goes to the most extreme disadvantageous split for the dictator, the 20-80 split. So that is partly why we're not seeing any significant, even marginally significant results in the 45-55 split, in the roughly equal split. So to summarize this, the study one, what this shows is that there is a potential problem of social desirability bias. Now, this problem, we designed this set of experiments explicitly to try to induce social desirability bias. The question is whether social desirability bias naturally happens in the lab. We don't think it probably happens naturally in the lab, but the question is what happens when you take it out to the field, and what can you do to solve it. Let me move on to BX2. So is it subject to improvement, the BX method, by recovering the full distribution of personal normative beliefs as well as normative expectations? So here, as I mentioned, we do the baseline treatment as well against the BESA treatment. These are the graphs of the results for the standard dictator game. So here We're not restricting the action set to only 3 possible actions in the dictator game. We are actually allowing them 11 possible actions, ranging from sending 0 to sending 100% to the dictator. What is it what we see? In the BX baseline treatment, where we elicit the singleton personal normative beliefs, there is no information on the intensive margin, right? So we only capture the most socially appropriate action. And that generates this peak in the normative expectations. BESA elicits the full distribution in the first step, and it elicits the full distribution or the distribution over the average distribution in the second step. So what we see is that BESA elicits a lower level of consensus, perhaps a lower overstated consensus compared to the baseline treatment. We see the same pattern. These distributions are statistically different from each other using Kolmogorov-Smirnov test. And we see the same pattern in the other 2 dictator games. So as you remember, in part 2, participants saw 2 dictator games that different from the one in the first part. So either a player 1 earned or also a player 2 earned dictator game. We see this not only with the dictator games, but also with other naturally occurring situations. So this suggests that using the BESA treatment may be a good improvement or a good addition to the BX framework. Now, notice that this this is unrelated to the first question about social desirability bias. If there are no questions, I can jump to the study for KW1.
Diego, quick question, if I may.
Sure.
If you can just go back, are you surprised by the shape of the extremes sort of on each side? So if you look on the left-hand side, the P1E, that sort of the normative expectation is sort of higher for, let's say, 0 than it is for, 30% or something, and then it spikes. Like, are you surprised that it actually goes down? I might have expected maybe, either a slow incline or, maybe flat. What do you make of this?
So personally, I'm not so. I mean, I'm surprised that it's not. I'm more surprised by what I'll show you in the KW, at least relative to my priors. But perhaps I don't know if my priors were wrong. But here we're describing the protocols used by Cherry et al. So we're describing the protocols that participants showed. Player 1s showed up to the lab, solved GMAT problems for 45 minutes. Then they earned an endowment based on the number of problems they solved. After that amount of time, another set of participants arrived to the lab, and player 1s had to decide how much to send to those players, right? So in a sense, there was a real effort task that they had spent effort for a long amount of time to earn that amount of money, and now they're asked to send to a random player that they will, random anonymous player that they will not interact with. So I'm a bit surprised, by this local peak here, rather than by the other.
Can I say something?
Please.
It's always problematic that we use a dictator game because the dictator game is very different from a trust game or a social dilemma game or an ultimatum game, where there seems to be a clear norm, okay? And it seems that P1E, there is a conflict between fairness, 50-50, and desert, I deserve it. And you see the 2 peaks there. One is 0 and the other is a half, that you would hardly see in other games where there are very clearly there are certain social norms that we translate to the game. It seems to me that the dictator has really no social norm related to it. Okay, and we know, from all the host of dictator games that have been played, etc., that it is very difficult. It's a difficult game to use. And it seems to me in these 2 cases shows clearly that on the one hand, I put desert, I merit, I deserve it, which is a way of interpreting fairness. It is fair that I get all. And in the other case, instead I say, no, you know, it is important to share. But these are equally important considerations, and you can go to one or the other in a dictator game, not in other games.
I agree. I subscribe to a lot of what you said. So I have a few, I perceive a few differences in the following sense. So I think the dictator game is very useful precisely because it's so simple and it removes all strategic interactions. Of course, as you say, there are competing principles, right? So you can think of desert versus equity, right? Which are conflicting principles, particularly in the P1E. They are not conflicting, or they are to a lesser extent in the standard dictator game. Now, I'm not sure I would say that that means that there is no social norm. I think, and I will show you later some graphs, that I think that people have different, perceive different types of norms for these different dictator games. And some of them can be clearly, I mean, show a clear influence of this competing and different principles. Now, I think that what people do in the dictator game, and this is, I mean, what I believe from, you know, some of the evidence I've seen, is people probably trade off some of their normative beliefs with the utility from, you know, getting money as a dictator. So, but I also agree, you know, dictator games for eliciting norms are useful, but we also want to see how these mechanisms perform in other situations, and that's why we move all the way to naturally occurring situations outside of the lab using vignettes. So let me jump quickly to study one for KW. And here our question is, can it appropriately handle asymmetric differences in deviations from normatively prescribed actions? And, you know, does adding a neutral option help? So this is the typical graph we see regarding the mean social acceptability. So on the horizontal axis, you see the percentage of the endowment sent by the dictator. There's the different options that the dictator could take. On the vertical axis, you see the degree of social desirability bias, the degree of social acceptability that participants judged using the KW method. So first thing to note is that there are sharp differences between the standard dictator game and the player one earned dictator game. So this is, again, this is what I was saying, that I was expecting to see actually higher social acceptability for sending zero, but perhaps that was based on my priors, or that reveals, you know, my internal second order beliefs about participants. And it should be noted that our right tails of the distributions differ slightly from the original KW study. Now, a few points worth noting. First, we don't see any differences in mean social acceptability for sending more than 50. So for extremely generous offers, more than 50%, we do not see any significant differences when we add the neutral option. So my prior, or I guess our priors, were that adding the neutral option would tend to flatten above the 50%. You know, essentially, you know, it's neither appropriate nor inappropriate. It's whatever you want to do. We're not seeing that. And these results are robust to estimating, you know, a different model with intercept and slopes using, you know, the dictator games for part 2. So these results seem to be very, very robust. Now, we also want to explore how the neutral option is used. How am I doing on time?
You have like 6 minutes, but you have a bit more since we stopped you along the way. So
wow.
take a bit more.
I'll let me skip this and show you. So this is different types of normative profiles using Latin class analysis. So this is a little bit what I was referring to earlier. So we do for both for the baseline treatment and for the neutral treatment, separate estimations of Latin classes. And what we see is different classes of norm profiles that different groups of individuals have. And what we see is some heterogeneity in how individuals perceive those normative beliefs that, as I mentioned, you can infer from here stronger principles influencing different type of norms for different individuals. And what we see is that the distribution does change a little bit when you introduce the neutral option. So let me highlight one point in particular. So class 1 and class 5 here, seem to be, I mean, clearly they are very different from classes 2 and 4 in terms of normative profiles, or the social acceptability for sending very low amounts of money. So in the player 1 earned dictator game, under the standard treatment, we see that these two account for about 50%. These two account for a little bit more once we allow the neutral option. So we do see some shifts in the classification of types, or in the fraction of individuals whom we classify as according to different types. We don't find differences using the I don't know or the EXO treatment. So this seems very robust to this. The second point is very similar to Falucci and Nosenso. Let me see if I can get a couple of the vignettes for naturally occurring situations very, very quickly. So some of the things we want to do is detect an externally validated norm, detect changes in context, and avoiding type 1 errors. So one thing we do is we give them a vignette, and we are a little bit more specific than what it reads over there about tipping in a restaurant in Colombia. In a restaurant in Colombia, you would be expected to tip, to leave a gratuity of 10%. That is basically what we see here. We also see a bit of mass below, but we do see that at least, and this is the Krupka Weber elicitation method, seems to be suggesting that the most socially appropriate action seems to be the 10%. So we do seem to be capturing the prevailing naturally occurring norm. With BX, again, we see a strong peak in the 10% treatment. Here we see a stronger peak with BESA than with the baseline treatment. The baseline treatment actually is a little bit flatter on this between the 5 and 10%, but it still shows the 10% as the most socially appropriate action. So both of them seem to be capturing this naturally occurring norm. We examine changes in the relevant context. So we give them a vignette of a situation where two very close friends are about to meet, and we change. This is a change within subjects, random order, for how to greet each other, whether the situation occurred before or during the COVID-19 pandemic. And we give them several options, some that are very cold and distant that I think would be very inappropriate in most cultures, some that are too strong that would be also probably inappropriate among various cultures, and some that are in between and that probably vary by culture. The ones that are most appropriate in Bogota would be, probably actions 6 and 7 here. Well, 5 and 6 and 7. So here's what we see using the Krupka Weber method. Again, this is social appropriateness for the different actions before. This is before COVID, and this is during COVID. So again, what this shows is that, using this very simple vignette, we see that the method is actually capturing the change in behavior that we're seeing as reflected in the normative expectations. So we see that shaking hands or physical contact is much less appropriate during COVID than before COVID. We do the same thing for the BX method. And again, we find that a hug and a kiss are very socially inappropriate in a context before COVID, but during COVID, that is much less socially, or rather, normative expectations are much lower for that, and the highest normative expectations are for no physical contact, and this coincides with both. Finally, for avoiding type 1 errors, we give them another vignette about how appropriate it is to dress for class. And we give them a vignette where they have to choose different dress codes. And in Bogota, essentially wearing long pants seems to be part of the dress code. So either wearing sweatpants or jeans, it seems more appropriate than wearing shorts or wearing pajamas to class. We then change and have the same description of the situation, but we give them sort of a placebo. We only change the color of the shirts that people are going to receive. And we see, okay, when there is no normative component to the actions that they're taking, what do they report? So what we see here is very flat. So all are equally socially acceptable. The color of the t-shirt has no normative component. But we do see that when we introduce the neutral option, that tends to lower social acceptability. Presumably more people are choosing as neither socially appropriate nor socially appropriate, and that's what we see when we break it down. When we look at BX, we have here again the dress for class and the placebo. The dress for class matches the results for the seen in using the KW method. We see a much higher peak, which is something common using the standard BX using the singleton for the personal normative beliefs, and we see it much smoother with the BESA. Now, what we see with the placebo is that, as is the method, is since it's being asked for the singleton in the first step, this lends it subject to type 1 errors. So if it's to be used in the field, it should account for that and should include options, to ensure that it's either neither appropriate or inappropriate or something along those lines. So let me conclude very quickly. So as I mentioned, we examine, we do an assessment of 2 methods using 4 studies. The methods, this is not a horse race between methods because the methods capture different aspects or different margins of normative expectations. BX tends to capture the extensive margin, the number or percentage of individuals who find an action appropriate, while KW captures the intensive margin, the degree of the modal degree of social appropriateness. So they're capturing slightly different margins of normative expectations. For BX, as the social desirability bias can pose a challenge. It may be less of a problem in the lab. It may be more of a cause of concern in the field. And it's an interesting question whether some modifications could help and mitigate the risk of social desirability bias. BESA is a potential promising modification, not addressing social desirability bias, but addressing, reducing, smoothing out the normative expectations that we see, essentially reducing the perhaps overstated confidence in the normativity of a particular action. And BESA correlates fairly well with KW's most appropriate action. For KW, it seems very robust to the variations we explained. Neutral could be a potential improvement. It is barely noticeable under quote unquote normal circumstances. It may be useful for type 1 cases where otherwise what you see reflected is very high levels of social acceptability of actions that seem to carry no normative component. In terms of order effects, order of actions is irrelevant in KW. Order of situations has a small negative effect. So after running 19 situations, moving in order increases social, has a negative effect on social acceptability of around 0.1 standard deviations. One question we did not tackle here is how does social desirability bias affect KW or whether it does at all. Now, we did not consider it partly because it's never asking for personal belief, personal normative beliefs. It's only asking about higher order beliefs. So we expected it not to, but it is an empirical question. It's something that we hope to be able to explore. So I think I'm out of time, and there are I see some questions.
Great, Diego. Thanks so much. Very rich in detail. I actually pushed Diego to present both papers sort of in one, because I think it's great to see them sort of side by side. So thanks so much for making that happen. Yeah, so let's open to questions. Christina has her hand up, and then we'll go from there.
You're on mute, Christina.
Thank you so much for the presentation. It's really good and interesting. Two very, very, very small comments. One is what you are proposing is basically to Krupka Weber is to use a full Likert scale, where you have a middle point, which is indifference, which they don't use. And some people don't use it for a reason, if you talk to psychologists, because sometimes it becomes like a focal point, okay? So it may be a little problematic, first point, and we can talk about that. And the second is why it is important, to me at least, to ask about personal normative beliefs, because often, not completely often, but often enough, there is a difference between the personal normative beliefs and the normative expectation. They don't coincide in the following sense. People think that there is a norm about X, but they personally don't agree with the norm or not subscribe to the norm or wouldn't like to enforce the norm. It's called pluralistic ignorance. And the pluralistic ignorance is very important in a lot of practical applications. And so obviously having both the PNBs and the normative expectation is very important to highlight that. And here I stop.
Thank you. Quick comment. We don't find any evidence. Am I on? Is my mic on? Yes. We don't find any evidence of coordination on the middle neutral category. So that was a concern. I had to rush through that. I did not manage my time very well. So we do not find any evidence of coordination, of using the neutral option to coordinate. We see that it's used extensively by most participants, but they use it sparingly. So 75% of the participants use it less than 3 times amongst the 10 possible options that they have in part 1. And we really examine the degree of whether how they use it in different situations, not only in Dictator Games, but in natural occurring situations. And they seem to be using it very carefully. So they do not use it, at least in the way it's constructed in the many different situations that we see. We find no evidence of them using it to coordinate. On the second point, I agree that it's important to elicit personal normative beliefs, especially when you're interested about the potential for pluralistic ignorance. Now, I guess the question is, whether you can ask for personal normative beliefs and use Krupka Weber, or whether you can ask for personal normative beliefs and use a modification for the BX for your method if you think that social desirability bias is a problem. So I mean, there are methods to address social desirability bias, right? I mean, there are plenty of methods that exist for that. The problem for BX is not that it is not about social desirability bias in the responses for personal normative beliefs. It is in the expectation of social desirability bias in the second step. So that is what could create a problem, right? If there is an expectation for social desirability bias, that is sort of what we show when we look at the graph that you asked about the awareness, right? So,
okay,
great. I see Daniela. Daniela, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thank you, Diego. Very nice talk. I really like this type of methodological work. I think it's really important. I have a question about, connects a little bit with what Christina was saying. I'm struggling a little bit to understand, your results on social desirability bias, in the sense that I would have thought that, that normative expectation should incorporate social desirability bias. And that could be one of the reasons of difference between personal normative belief and normative expectation, right? So personal normative belief, you can say what you want, what you believe is true, but you might sort of not be aware of that there is a social demand for saying something different, which you incorporate in the normative expectation. So in a way, your result maybe, is not so good news, because you would want this to be incorporated more strongly in the normative expectations.
So thank you, Daniele. I'm not sure if I'm understanding correctly. The way I see it is, when you elicit normative expectations, you're eliciting second or higher order beliefs about, the beliefs of appropriateness that others have. Now, if the way I'm doing this is by incentivizing responses on unincentivized personal normative beliefs, and there is social desirability bias in personal normative beliefs, this may be a problem, particularly in the field. Think of a following situation. Someone goes to the field and asks about, whether taboo behavior or behavior that, we tend to consider reprehensible, like female genital mutilation, or, like child marriage, things like that. If someone from outside the community starts asking questions about that, social desirability bias may mask both personal normative beliefs, but also normative expectations about that. So that would give you a different type of diagnosis of the underlying causes of behavior. So if social norms are incorporated into that, but people think, but participants believe that others will not report that due to social desirability bias, due to the idea of trying to look better, or remove that taboo belief, or hide that taboo belief from outsiders, then that could pose a problem. So I think I was not very clear on this at the beginning, but part of our motivation here is not necessarily for capturing norms in the lab, but when you're going outside of the lab and using these methods to try to capture naturally occurring social norms, and how what are the potential drawbacks, and how social desirability bias may impact that. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, my point was more like, it seems to me that if something is socially desirable to the point that it changes the way I tell what is appropriate or inappropriate, that sort of, to me, tells me that there is a norm around that behavior that goes in the direction of what I tell you when I'm subject to social desirability bias.
So, I mean, I guess, okay, Cristina?
Yes, along the line of Daniele, a norm is not just defined by the normative, empirical expectation, whatever, but by the conditional preference. You prepare to follow that behavior on condition that blah, blah, blah. And as Daniele says, you may, yes, there is social desirability, but maybe just because there is a norm, and then you see people behaving exactly in that way. Okay, so certainly social desirability is something we always have in mind when we do surveys. And I should add that when we want to measure personal beliefs, there are techniques, randomizing techniques, that will not tell me what John or Mary really believe, but will tell me what on average people believe. This is another question I don't want to discuss. But as Daniele says, in the end, social desirability bias means that people know that there is a good way or a bad way of behavior, and typically then you see if there is a correspondence, a correlation between the normative expectation and the behavior. There is a norm. So, and I stop here.
So I mean, I think it does not. I mean, we've been discussing about this internally, but I think one, it may not necessarily mean that you have a view of something that is wrong. You may have a view that outsiders think it's wrong, right? So if you bring outsiders, or like a study is being conducted or funded by outsiders, then you may have different norms, and you may adjust. I mean, social desirability may be reflecting norms about, that you think others have, rather than norms internal to the community. So that would be one point. But I think there's also social desirability has been examined in situations where I do not see a lot of normativity. So in personality traits, feelings of powerlessness. So I don't see very strong normativity there, but there seems to be that social desirability bias still has an effect on that. So, and I'm sorry, I think Eric, you wanted to comment.
You made the point I wanted to make.
Okay.
Thanks.
So let me give you, Diego, like a chance, like 30 seconds to close on a big picture point, which is you sort of vaguely suggest that there might be some adjustments to especially to the BX method. Is there something you had in mind in particular? Is there like any ways of like introducing belief elicitations to check for the extent of SDBs in that context? Like, what did you have in mind when you made that suggestion?
So I mean, we don't have a very detailed way. We are thinking, so one of the next steps we're thinking is taking this out to the field in Bogota, and essentially checking and trying to induce social desirability using more direct face-to-face questions versus more indirect, having people just report their answers in a tablet and making that common knowledge. So if we find differences there on using vignettes of situations where we expect to find social desirability bias, that may prove a way of doing, right? So essentially like common knowledge of anonymity, for instance. But this is at this point it's speculative. I think the bigger picture question is, we have two widely used important methods for eliciting normative expectations. And I think we should be investing, as you know, we start using them more intensively. We should start investing a little bit more in examining the properties and drawbacks, as has been done for methods for factual belief elicitation. So we're not the first ones to do this, as I cited in the literature. There are others who are working on this, but we think this is an important area to explore.
Great, Diego. Thanks so much. Thanks to Francesco and Eric in the comments for providing answers. Paulius, is there anything you want to add before we conclude?
No, that's all. I would like to thank all of you and remind you that in 3 weeks we have our next talk with Michael Holsworth, the managing director of the Behavioral Insights team North America. And that's it on my side.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thanks.